Samuel Taylor Coleridge was a poet of a bygone day. In his tale of the Ancient Mariner, he writes, "Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wild wide sea, and never a saint took pity on my soul in agony." David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, in Psalm 31 verse 12, he states, "I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind." I wonder, do you feel like that? Alone on a wild, wide sea. This state of isolation or lockdown, whatever you want to call it, as it has gone on this past week, you feel yourself perhaps to be alone on the ocean of life. Well, in the Bible, there are many lessons that we can learn from isolation. And over the next number of weeks, I want to look at the theme of isolation in the Bible. But to start off with this little study, the individuals that came to my mind as I was thinking about being in lockdown, or this state of isolation, or this state really of being all alone, some of the first individuals in the Bible who would have felt themselves to be isolated were Hagar and Ishmael. And you read of Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis chapter 21. And they were alone. They were in a wilderness. They were in the wilderness of Beersheba. But, and this is what I want you to really understand, they were surrounded by the Lord. Although they felt themselves to be alone, yet they were surrounded by, they were watched by the Lord, they were observed by the Lord. The Lord noticed the fact that they were all alone. And remember that whilst you feel yourself to be alone and you feel yourself to be isolated, yet if you are a Christian, you are before God and He sees you in that state of isolation, and He surrounds you by His love. And just for a few moments today, I want us to think about Ishmael and Hagar as they're found in Genesis 21 under the heading Surrounded by God. The first thing I want you to see here is their providence. Their providence. In Genesis chapter 21, unfortunately, we read of the providence or the circumstances of Hagar and Ishmael. Who was Hagar, you ask? Well, Hagar was the handmaid of Sarah, who was Abraham's wife. Of course, Abraham had been given a promise by God, and that promise was that he would have a son, and that he would also have a people as numerous as the sand, the grains of sand on the ocean, or the stars in the sky. But as of yet, and their lives were passing, they were getting much older, and as of yet that had not been fulfilled. And Sarah was starting to get apprehensive about the fulfillment of that promise by God. And so she makes a suggestion. The suggestion is that Hagar, her handmaid, should have a son with Abraham, her husband. This happens, and as a result, Abraham has Ishmael to Hagar. And Ishmael, he begins to grow up. But then the fulfillment of the promise comes to Sarah, and Abraham and Sarah have their son Isaac. He is, of course, the son of promise, and it was through Isaac's line that the Jewish nation would grow and would flourish. But anyway, these two families, they grow up together in Genesis chapter 21, these two family units. And as brothers do, Ishmael and Isaac begin to fight. And Ishmael, the older brother, well, in Genesis 21, you read of him provoking his younger brother Isaac. And this really annoys Sarah, Isaac's mother. And Sarah comes to Abraham. And in Genesis 21 verse 10, you read of Sarah essentially telling Abraham to cast out the bondwoman and her son. In other words, Abraham, get rid of Hagar and get rid of Ishmael. And Abraham, he does this. He recognizes that Ishmael is not the son of promise. And unfortunately, he tells Hagar and also Ishmael, his natural son, to leave to go to the wilderness the wilderness of Beersheba. In verse 14, he actually gives them some bread and a bottle of water. But that would not have been enough really to sustain them in the wilderness. It was just really, I feel, enough to salve his conscience. And so they go to this wilderness. They leave the home that they enjoyed and they go to the wilderness. And what I want you to see here in terms of the circumstances of Hagar and Ishmael is that a providence has come along their way where they are now in a wilderness, and it is really through no major fault of their own. Yes, Ishmael, he had that fallout with his brother, but brothers fall out all the time. It was through no fault of their own, and yet we now find them in a state of isolation or alone in this wilderness. And in verse 15, you read in Genesis chapter 21 that the water was spent in the bottle. In other words, they run out of water. And this sends Hagar into a state really of turmoil. And she actually tells her young son Ishmael to hide under the shrubs so that he will not become dehydrated through the heat in the desert. And so I want you to see here a mother and her son, Ishmael and Hagar, and they're alone, they are isolated through no fault of their own, but nonetheless this is a providence from God, and now they have run out of supplies. Do you see how we can at times face similar things today, and even especially in this state of lockdown and isolation? And perhaps you've been there. Providence has dealt you that hard blow. It's dealt us all a hard blow, but there will be others who will feel this providence more acutely, more keenly than some. And perhaps you're there today and you're maybe even questioning, has the Lord forgotten me? Does he remember me at all? Does he see me in this state of isolation? Well, I want you to follow the pattern of Ishmael, and this is a good thing for young people. Here's Ishmael, he is probably a teenager at this stage, and you read in verse 17 that God heard the voice of the lad. Unfortunately, you don't read of his mum praying in this text, but you read of the young teenager. He's the one that is praying, and he prays. So not only do we think about their providence, but we also think about their praying. And he prays, and he obviously asks God to supply the need. He has run out of water, his mum's run out of water, and he asks God to supply the need. And child of God, in the midst of this dark providence, and you will at times have great needs if you do not already have them. And what are you to do at such a time? You're to pray. You're to follow the pattern of Ishmael. You are to pray. You are to bring this need to the Lord. Of course, Philippians 4 tells us they shall supply all of our need according to his riches. And so you, in your state of isolation, in your state of separation, as it were, from others, you are to pray like Ishmael. And there's a wonderful end to this story, because we not only read of their providence and their prayer, but we also read then of their provision. In Genesis chapter 21, we read then in verse 19 that God opened her eyes, that's Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well. And we then read of her taking water from that well and placing it in the bottle and so on. And this then was a means of sustaining her. And I want you to see then that her need was met. Her need was met. In her state of isolation, the fact she was in a wilderness here, through the prayers of her son, her need was met. And remember this. Remember that when there are those times when your back is against the wall, especially at times of isolation, and you have the questions, the worries and the doubts, remember that you are surrounded by God. The Lord, he sees you. Hagar exclaimed in the wilderness, "Thou God seest me. Thou God seest me." This was her response to all of this. The Lord saw her in the wilderness. Now remember that then, beloved, that whilst you may have been dealt a dark providence, a dark blow, when you pray, the Lord provides. He provides. And it may be just the very thing you need. Perhaps it's been there all along. My thought in Genesis 21 is that this was not a miracle. Some commentators do believe that the well was there all along, but she was so taken up with her circumstances that she just didn't see this well. And very often that's the way God works, isn't it? The answer's there right before us, but we don't see it. And so I trust that as you feel your state of isolation, remember this, that none of us really are alone if you are a Christian. The Bible tells us in Hebrews 13 that the Lord will not forget us nor forsake us. He will never leave us nor forsake us. And this really is a practical example of this in Genesis 21. The Lord saw Hagar and Ishmael, saw them in need, and in answer to prayer, he met that need. So I trust today that you learn the first lesson in isolation, the fact that we are surrounded by God in our state of isolation. May the Lord bless these truths to your heart this morning.